Hi, thank you for tuning into the 6th episode of the Shorewood Stacks. I'm Lisa Quintero, Young Adult Librarian.
And I'm Nick Barron, patron and sometimes volunteer.
As you know, this is the show where we talk to you about library news, what we've been reading, and what is going on in terms of library events.
Library news.
So, as many of you know, the stay-at-home order got overturned by the Supreme Court. However, that does not mean that the library is reopening to in-person visits yet. The stay-at-home order for Milwaukee County, I believe, goes through May 21st. So the library is working on figuring out when it will open to in-person visits again. For now, we will continue curbside pickup. So if you would like materials, you can still request them via email, via our online form, or you can call us. Keep an eye on our website and social media channels for updates as things progress.
From the stacks. All right, so I read Big Black Stand at Attica by Jared Reinmuth, and how would you pronounce that?
Ameziane, maybe?
Ameziane. All right, very good. 4 Days in 1971 changed the course of American history. It is the story of Frank Big Black Smith, who was one of the inmates at Attica during the 1971 prison riot. Now, I'm going to give a little TMI. Some people, when they talk about their grandparents, are like, "Oh, my grandfather was in World War II and he was a war hero," or a lot of people have these very grand stories about their grandparents. Mm-hmm. My grandfather was a criminal, and so in 1971, 2 years before I was born, he was actually an inmate at Attica at the same time. So Lisa stumbled upon this book and was like, "Oh, this is something that you might find interesting." And I've always wanted to know more about what happened at Attica. And so I was like, "Okay, yeah, this looks good." Mind you, Lisa will bring home a stack of things for me to go through, and this was the thing that I pulled out of the stack. And it was a very interesting book. It was actually co-written by Jared Reinmuth and Frank Big Black Smith. They started working on it together in 1997, and it chronicles Frank Big Black Smith's life leading up to getting incarcerated at Attica, and then the bulk of the book is about what happened at Attica. And I think, for me, it answered some questions. It raised a lot of concerns, because when we look back at history, we like to think about how much has changed, and sometimes you look back at history and you realize how much has stayed the same. And the one thing that I was really interested in was at the front of the book, there is the 15 practical proposals of rebelling Attica prisoners. This was the demands that the prisoners made. And I'm not going to read all 15 demands, but some of them were: apply the New York State minimum wage law to all state institutions. In all caps, stop slave labor. Allow New York State prisoners to be politically active without intimidation or reprisals. There's a whole list of things in here that I know that some changes were made since the 70s into the correctional facility system, but just the thing, that first one that I read, apply the New York State minimum wage law to all state institutions. I know that in the case of prisoners, they make pennies on the dollar compared to what the actual minimum wage is, and it's very sad and very frustrating that out of what took place at Attica, not much has changed. As far as what took place at Attica, there was a lot of racial tensions and a lot of things that were going on at other correctional facilities around the country, and there was kind of the perfect storm of what was going on, and ultimately there was an act of retribution by some of the guards to try and punish the inmates. It was actually a thing where they were leading them to the yard, but had deliberately locked the yard so that they could basically toy with and enrage the inmates. Except the guards didn't tell all the guards, and so the guard that was leading them to the yard ended up being locked in with the inmates. a ruckus started. Somebody tried to step in and got punched, and before you knew it, the guards had locked all of the inmates into the courtyard, and the inmates had taken over the courtyard with a number of people, both civilians and guards, locked in with them. And they ended up taking hostages in order to try and make these demands known to the world. And it's a very compelling story. It's a very sad story.
Yeah, like, I think it's interesting that, you know, like you said, that the demands in 1971 were not similar to what's going on today, because from my understanding, prisoners have to pay for everything that they have in prison. So, like, if you want soap, if you want toothpaste, if you need a toothbrush, if you want snacks to have in your bunk, if you know, and from what I understand, if there's a lockdown, you know, you don't get to go to the cafeteria. So you want to have food that you have stashed in your cell for those times when you can't leave your cell.
Yeah.
And all of those things cost money. And when you're making pennies on the dollar, you know, a lot of inmates, from what I understand, have to use ingenuity to make their own supplies or to, like, trade supplies with other prisoners. Like, I think I've mentioned before that on this podcast that I listen to, a podcast named Ear Hustle, which is about prisoners at San Quentin, and they talk a lot about, you know, how they get supplies and how some people make a living in prison by, you know, making soap for all other inmates and things like that, because they do it on a cheaper scale than what it costs from the commissary.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think it's sad that, you know, this is over 40 years later, and this is still the reality of prisoners in America. As far as your grandfather goes, do you know anything about what his time at Attica was like? I know that your dad doesn't really talk about him much. So.
Yeah, no. Other than that, during the riots, I know that my dad said that he hid under a mattress in the yard while everything was going down. I don't really know anything about his particular involvement, other than that he hid. But I should get back to, really, this is the story of Big Black, which I think I should focus on for a minute, and that's that this is a man that moved to New York with his mom. He was a football player and seemed like in certain ways his life wasn't so bad, but he also got involved in drugs and crime and ended up being incarcerated and eventually ended up at Attica. And he just had a natural charisma and ability to lead people. And so he ended up being brought on as the football coach within Attica. And when everything erupted at Attica, he actually wasn't one of the people that was initially involved, but he ended up being tapped because of his leadership skills. He got tapped by a bunch of the activists and was asked to be the head of security to oversee the hostages. And
so was he a prisoner, or was he?
He was a prisoner.
Okay.
Yeah, he was a prisoner, and he was asked to oversee the hostages because of the fact that he was considered to be he was a big man, very very strong-willed, and had a natural ability to lead others. People respected him because he was the football coach. And so he got tapped for this role, and he got tapped for this role by those that were revolting in the prison. And he, unfortunately, by taking on that role, it also made him a target for a number of the guards. They saw him as being part of the leadership, and he knew that there would be ramifications for taking this role. But he wanted, according to the story, he wanted to protect the guards and protect the hostages. One of the guards actually was a friend of his. And so, he took the role very seriously, and also the Muslim Brotherhood were all of the people that were responsible for protecting the guards as well, and the hostages. And so it tells his story. It's from his viewpoint, and where it gets really, like, after they go through all of the negotiations and all of the things that were going on between the governor, who was Nelson Rockefeller at the time, and with the warden and what have you. It's a really interesting story, but where it really gets ugly is after they go through the negotiations, and the negotiations fail because they won't offer the prisoners any form of amnesty for what took place. And because they couldn't get amnesty, they couldn't come to an agreement, and so it got green-lighted for the state troopers to storm the prison and just fire at will. And so a great number of people died. I think it was 39. I'm not sure exactly, but a large number of people died. It was a massacre, and the way the media covered it portrayed the inmates as being that they were slitting throats and doing all sorts of things. After the autopsies were done, after it comes out that none of that was actually taking place, and so there was this ramped up media narrative that turned a lot of average folks against what they were trying to achieve at Attica. And then, years after they released the information, none of what they alleged that the prisoners were doing, or very little of it, actually took place. In addition to all of that, the other aspect is that after the building was stormed, Frank Black was one of the survivors, but they chose to torture him. And so he was repeatedly beat and tortured over a series of days, and it affected him for the rest of his life. But when he got out, he also got involved in drug counseling, in prison rights, and a number of other things. So even though this negatively impacted him, it also gave him strength to pursue other things. So what have you been reading?
So I've actually been reading 2 different graphic novels. I read Shuri by Nnedi Okorafor, and I read Clyde Fans by Seth. And Clyde Fans, like Big Black's Stand at Attica, is kind of a darker book, whereas Shuri was a little bit lighter because it's a Marvel superhero book. But yeah, I'll start with Clyde Fans. Clyde Fans is a story of 2 brothers who own a electric fan company in Canada, and the company was founded by their father, whose name was Clyde Matchard. And so this is about the Matchard brothers, Simon and Abraham. And Simon is this very introverted brother, and Abraham is extroverted, and he's the one who ends up taking on the mantle of running the business and being a door-to-door salesman and doing all that sort of work, whereas his brother does the accounting and the ads and the behind-the-scenes kind of work, because his brother suffers from crippling anxiety and is just a very shy person and does not do well with people. So the story is interesting because it's both about this business and how it failed over several decades. It takes place in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, and it follows the story of the brothers as their relationship changed over time. How, when they were younger, they didn't really understand each other, and as they got older, they still didn't really understand each other until one of them passes away, and then the one who is left behind kind of understands the one who's gone a little bit more once he's gone. And part of the story is also about the brother Simon, the introverted one, taking care of his mom as she deteriorates into dementia, and how his relationship is different with his mother than his brother's relationship with his mother, and how his brother Abraham tends to put a lot of the pressure on Simon to do everything, and gets mad at Simon when things aren't as Abraham wants them, but Simon is the one who's actually living day in and day out with his mother who has dementia. So it's a pretty sad story. It's told in vignettes. So there's the first section is told from Abraham's perspective, and it's him looking back. And the second section is told from Simon's perspective, and it's him trying to venture out and be a salesman at one point, and his brother kind of discouraging him from being a salesperson, and him kind of finding his own path for a little bit. And then the third part is kind of ties everything together. The art is beautiful. The story was very touching, but it's also a hard thing to read because it's, about serious stuff that a lot of families go through, and anybody who's dealt with a relative with dementia knows that is something that is very hard to watch and to be responsible for, and to just, it's just hard. So, but it's ultimately, it's a very, very true to life book, and the author said that he wrote it because he lives in Canada, and the Clyde Fans company was actually a real thing, and he walks by this building every day, and he started to think about what the story would be about the business, because in the window of the building he could see a picture of two middle-aged men on the wall, and so he came up with the story of these brothers. And, it's not a real story, but he just kind of used the real Clyde Fans as a backdrop for the story of these imaginary brothers. And if you like realistic fiction, family stories, I would recommend it. On the other hand, if you want something lighter, which, I picked up Clyde Fans off of the shelf because it looked interesting, and I had read some reviews of it because I ordered the graphic novels at the library, and it got a lot of very good reviews, and it is a good book, but I was not expecting it to be so dark, and right now, it's not exactly what I was looking to read, but I read it, and I don't regret it. It definitely made me cry. So then I decided to read Shuri because I needed something to kind of counteract that, and Shuri is Black Panther's sister, and so this graphic novel is called Shuri, The Search for Black Panther, and it was written by science fiction author Nnedi Okorafor, and it is about Shuri's character. She is developing technologies so that Wakanda can go out to space, and she sends her brother out to space with her boyfriend Manifest, I believe is his name, or Manifold, I can't remember. It's either Manifest or Manifold. And she sends them out to space, and they get sucked into this wormhole, and they disappear for 2 weeks. And so she has to take on the mantle of Black Panther, which is something that she's, in the comics, she has done before, but she doesn't want to do it again, because in the comics, in the previous time that she took on the mantle of Black Panther, when T'Challa disappeared, she ended up dying, and then she ended up going to the land of the ancestors, and then she comes back, and it was this whole traumatic thing, and so she doesn't want to go through that all over again.
Superheroes die all the time.
They do. That's the multiverse. And so, in the Black Panther story, she goes, to the world of the ancestors, and she's brought back, and her hair changes color, and then eventually her hair changes back, and so she's been through all this traumatic stuff, and she's like, I don't want to go through all of that again. So she tells her mother that she doesn't want to take on the mantle of Black Panther, but her mother, is pushing her to do so, because T'Challa had started a nation organization trying to unite all the nations of Africa, and without him there, her mother was worried that this union would fall apart, and so she wanted Shuri to take on the role so that the rest of Africa would feel like Wakanda was, there for them, and would ensure their safety and would protect them if anything happened. And so it's a lot about, responsibility and being true to yourself. And, she wants to help Wakanda, and she wants to find her brother, and she wants to, do the right thing, but at the same time, she doesn't want to keep living under her brother's shadow or pretending to be her brother because she is not her brother. And so it's a very, empowering story of finding yourself in your own way. And it's cool because there's a lot of female characters in this collection of graphic novels, or it's like a collection of comics and all in one trade paperback from the storyline that Nnedi Okorafor wrote. And so one of the people who helps her along the way is Storm from the X-Men, because in this series, Storm is T'Challa's girlfriend, and so when T'Challa goes missing, she comes to help his sister, and then there's this council of women that's pulled together by Shuri's mother to kind of try and make decisions for Wakanda. And that's the people who approach Shuri to get her to try and take on the mantle of Black Panther. And so some of them understand more where Shuri's coming from, and some of them don't. And they all have different perspectives, and they all get to voice their perspectives, which I think was really cool, because I think a lot of times in graphic novels, I mean, it's changed more so now, but a lot of times in graphic novels, most of the characters are men, and most of the characters, if there are any female characters, their motivations and their actions are all, you know, guided by men or propelled forward by men. And this, it's a very woman-centered story, and I just really like the character of Shuri because she's just so intelligent and adventurous, and, you know, she loves her brother, and she loves what she does, and she loves Wakanda, but she also just wants to be true to herself. So yeah, it was more of an uplifting story than Clyde Fans.
Yeah. Still, your presentation made it sound pretty serious.
I mean, it's serious, but it's serious in like a comic book, you know,
Yeah.
like not like a serious graphic novel. It's more serious than like a you know, Captain America Winter Soldier kind of way than a real story like what you read, or a fictionalized version of what life was like in the 1960s and 70s for traveling salesmen like what I read. So
the one thing that I will take away from what you said, though, is there are much easier ways to go about changing your hair color.
Yeah, well, she didn't die on purpose, Nick.
That is an interesting thing about you know, when you're trying to represent things in like a graphic novel form. You know, how do I make this person different to show that they've been through something? Uh-huh. And you know, changing the color of one thing is just one way to go about that.
Oh yeah, one thing I forgot to mention too in this series, for those who are fans of Rocket and Groot, they are also in one of the comics contained within the series, because since Black Panther ends up out in space in this wormhole, Shuri gets one of T'Challa's ex-girlfriends to help her out, and she's a mystic, and she helps Shuri have this out-of-body experience, and Shuri like astral projects herself into Groot, and it's pretty entertaining because, you know, in Guardians of the Galaxy, Groot's always like, I am Groot, but when Shuri takes over his body, he's like, I am Shuri. And Rocket still understands everything that he's saying, and it's Shuri communicating with Rocket, but when Groot's like, when you see Groot talking, Groot's just saying, I am Shuri, I am Shuri, just like he says, I am Groot, I am Groot.
It's kind of funny. The one thing that I forgot to mention when I was talking about Big Black Stand at Attica, I like the art style. It's a good art style. I would like to mention that with the massacre and the beatings and torture, those things are depicted, at least on a certain level, and so it's a fairly graphic book, just so people know. It's not a light read.
Yeah, and that can be more impactful with a graphic novel because you're seeing actual images of it rather than just reading about it.
Yeah, even with elements left out, it was still shocking.
But yeah, so if you are interested in any of these, all of these are available in graphic novel format at the Shorewood Library. We will be returning them this week, so you can go ahead and request them for curbside pickup if you're interested in any of them.
Virtual events.
Join Miss Heidi on Tuesdays on Facebook for Rhyme Time.
Join Miss Susan for Virtual Art Cart on Wednesdays. You can find instructions for weekly projects on our website.
Miss Heidi is also now offering story time online on Facebook on Thursdays at 9 a.m., so be sure to check it out. We'll be taking a break next week since the library will be closed for the Memorial Day holiday, so there will not be a Shorewood Stacks next week. However, we will be back the following week. So until then, thanks for listening, and be well. The Shorewood Stacks is produced by Lisa Quintero and Nick Barron, with music by Kevin MacLeod. The title of this song is Ice Flow and can be found on incompetech.com.